those people who were incarcerated during World War II could never have imagined the way it has turned out, such that there are so many people practicing Soto Zen nowadays in the United States. Here in St. Louis, for example, there are 4 Soto Zen centers. We are all relatively small, but we are in the Midwest. And I believe throughout the country, throughout the United States, there are several hundred Zen centers. And I have no way of knowing how many people have been ordained as Zen priests, but I would guess anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 people. So it really has flourished in this country. So I represent today a person who was born far away from Buddhism, far away from any Asian influence, a person who converted to Buddhism. And that's my story. But I hope all of you who are listening will find some way to resonate through your own life with the way that you've come in contact with Buddhism. And I have some photos I'd like to show. And here's one I wanted to start off here. Can everybody see this? Let's see. Here's a photo of 2 people who have been very important in my life. The woman on the left is my mom, my mother. And the woman on the left is Oeda-san, who I thought of as my grandmother. We were not related by blood, but I was much closer to her than I was to my own blood-related grandparents. And she lived in the small town of Obama, where the monastery where I lived for many years in Japan. And I knew her, first of all, because she was very skillful at making kimonos, and that was the main reason I got to know her. But I would often stop in to see her. And one of the things that she told me so many times is that each person has their unique path to walk in life. Even siblings, people born of the same parents, can have vastly different ways to walk in their life. But each person has their way to walk. And I always felt that she had my back. She was supporting me in my walk along the way. And another reason this photo is interesting to me is that I've lived exactly half of my life in America and half of my life in Japan. 36 years in both countries this year. In Buddhism, we say it's very difficult to be born a human being, and it's even much more difficult to come in contact with the Buddha Dharma. But those of us here tonight, I believe all of us, have had that opportunity to come in contact with the teaching of Zen and the practice of Zen. So what I'm going to talk about today is how I became interested in Zen and a little bit about the practice that I've had in my life, concentrating mainly on the monastic life I lived in Japan. So let me just stop that photo for a second. I want to give you a brief trajectory of my life. I was born in 1950 in Mason City, Iowa. Here in the Midwest, a fairly small town here in Iowa. My father had trained to be a jeweler and a watchmaker. That was his vocation. But at the age of 26, he decided that he wanted to go to college. He had never been to college. So around the time he was 26, 27, my family moved from Mason City to another small town in Iowa. He went through college In the process of going through college, he decided he wanted to become a Lutheran minister. That required 4 more years of study. So when I was in the middle of 2nd grade, we moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, which was directly north of where we were living. He went through that seminary, took 4 years of study. During that process of doing that study, he decided not only that he wanted to be a Lutheran minister, he wanted to be a missionary. He wanted to go abroad and tell other people about Christianity. And as I remember the story, he was given 3 choices of places that he would like to go. His first choice was Japan. His second was New Guinea. And his last choice was Brazil. And as fate would have it, he was given his first choice. So in 1961, when I was 10 years old, going on 11, my family moved from St. Paul, Minnesota to Tokyo, Japan, which I believe at that time was the largest city in the world. But before I go on, I want to say one thing, which is that I'm planning to speak for about 45, 50 minutes, more or less. There will be time at the end for questions. So at that time, really feel free to ask about anything I say or don't say. I'm happy to entertain all the questions. Anyway, my family arrived in Japan in August 1961. I can still remember that stepping off the plane, that experience. And I have to say, looking back now on my life, those first 2 years that I lived in Japan were particularly formable to me in my formation as a person. We lived for 2 years in Tokyo. At that time, my mother and father already had 6 children. I was the oldest. But one of the things that happened when we moved to Tokyo was that very quickly we became friendly with the neighborhood kids. We were all just kids, just intermingling freely. We were exotic to them, and they were very exotic to us, as you might imagine. All of the sense impressions, sights, sounds, smells, the people were exotic to us. But very quickly, we became friendly with these kids. And it seems to me that I was just on the cusp of childhood and adolescence. So it gave me a window into a vastly different culture. It's relatively difficult for adults to go into Japanese people's homes. At least it was 60 years ago. I don't know how it is now. But because we were kids, they would come into our home and we would go into their home. And there was just, it's difficult to explain, but just the sense of how different, in some ways, their culture was, the way they related. And one thing in particular that was important for me when I was young, at that time, was New Year's in Japan, 1962 and 1963. Some of the neighborhood young adults, I don't remember who it was, invited me and my brother to go at New Year's. In Japan it's called Hatsumode, so it's the first visit of the year to the shrine to make prayers for the new year. And we lived in Shinjuku, which is fairly close by train to a large shrine called Meiji Jingu, Meiji Shrine, one of the most popular shrines to do this Hatsumode in Japan, in Tokyo. I was looking on the internet today. It said that about 3 million people over the course of 3 days, the first 3 days of New Year's, go to make their prayers at this shrine. It's hard to express the sea of humanity maybe 40 or 50 people abreast, moving in a wave of humanity. But what was impressive as a young man to me, and as I look back, is the courtesy, the kindness, the gentleness of the people, the harmony, and the different sense of sacred, of what was sacred, of the gods which you couldn't see, and being in this tremendous park-like shrine with all of the pine trees, there was just something beautiful. And from an early age, I began to wonder about religion, the differences between religion and similarities. But particularly in my case, my father had gone to Japan with the idea of teaching the Japanese and possibly converting them to Christianity. And as I grew older during my teen years, this became a real question. Was this really necessary? Was this really a good idea? Was this, so how did that work in my life? After 2 years in Tokyo, our family moved south to near a town called Nagoya. From the time I went into 8th grade, I was in a boarding school. And then my life, as I entered adolescence, became considerably more difficult. The struggles that we often have with self-identity, finding our place in the world or out of the world. I escaped into music a lot, and I studied a lot. But nevertheless, being in Japan was part of my identity. It was something that I treasured in a way. When I was a senior in high school, I had a chance to meet 2 Zen priests. This was 1967. In high school, my senior year, I took a class called Japan Seminar. And this class, I remember there were 12 kids in the class. We took a weekend trip to Kyoto, the old capital of Japan. And we saw many of the famous sites, the temples and shrines in Kyoto and Nara. When we were there, we went to Daitokuji, one of the great Rinzai monasteries in Kyoto. And within the walls, the monastery walls of Daitokuji, there are many sub-temples. And we went to one in particular called Daisen-in. And when we were at Daisen-in, there was a Japanese monk, a young man, who spoke English, who gave us a tour around the temple and the temple gardens, so famous, the rock gardens of Daisen-in. And I was struck by this man, by his earnestness, his seriousness. And I remember to this day that he was barefoot. It was in November. It was cold. He was wearing what we call geta in Japanese, the wooden clogs. And I was struck by the austerity that he presented to me. I also met an American, Brian Daisen Victoria, who had gone to Japan to teach English under some Christian auspices, but after a certain time, he left that and became ordained as a Soto priest, as I am. The 1960s was a very unsettled time in American history. The Civil Rights Movement, the assassinations of the Kennedy brothers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and maybe more than anything, the Vietnam War. And this man, Daisen Victoria, was well known for resisting the Vietnam War in Japan as a Soto priest. I met him at a Quaker meeting group. From a young age, I knew that I didn't want to go into the war. I was thinking that conscientious objection status would be something that maybe it would help me not do that. So I met him at a Quaker meeting group. But in any case, from a young age, I had contact. Those were the seeds, I would say, that were planted in me. Of course, at the beginning, it wasn't as if I knew right away that I wanted to be a Zen priest, but these were conditions in my life. One of the things that really struck me about Kwong Roshi's talk last month was one word. He mentioned conformity and how strong should we call it the power of the power to conform in American history in the 1950s, after World War II, during the Cold War era. And it was really that pressure to conform that the beatniks, Kerouac, and Ginsberg, and Gary Snyder, and so on, that those people chafed against that pressure to conform, that they found freedom within the teaching of Zen. During the 1960s, it was the counterculture. So a younger generation of people looking for alternatives to all of these problems we saw in society, in American society. How would it be possible, even in the slightest, to change some of these conditions? Discrimination, war, poverty, and the environmental movement was just becoming aware at this time. I was part of that group. When I graduated from college in 1972, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I should be a bit more specific. I had no idea of some vocation that I wanted to pursue. I'd thought of going to graduate school, but no. This was still during the Vietnam War. I thought, no, I don't want to be involved in graduate school. And so this was a little bit of another part of my soul searching. What was I going to do? At that time, there were people who thought we can find a better society on the land. Very naive idea as I think back of it now, but I kind of went in that direction. I saw it was going to be more difficult than I ever thought possible to do that in the United States. I ended up traveling in Central America twice, looking for a possible place to live. I'm eternally grateful that I did not. On my second trip to Central America, I took a book with me called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Suzuki Shunryu, a book that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This was the first book on Zen that really gave me the inspiration that, yes, through the practice of Zen, I can find some answers. I'm looking for some answers. I had some questions about what can one person do about the big problems in life? And secondly, how can a person really genuinely live a satisfying life? We're on this earth. How can we really live a satisfying life? And this book inspired me to go back to Japan. Now, I'd had an interest in Zen even through college. My last year of college, I wrote my senior paper for a history professor on Zen. But many of the books that were available in English at that time, D.T. Suzuki, Alan Watts, and so on, they rarely mentioned the practice of sitting Zazen. But it was this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. I thought, yeah, I'll go back to Japan. This was 1974. And I'll try and find a teacher. I'll try and find a monastery where I can go and practice for 6 months or a year or 2 years, who knows? How long it was going to take, I had no idea. So 1974, December, I returned to Japan. My parents were still living in Japan. I still had a connection with Japan. I was going back every summer during college years to teach English in Japan. I still had a feeling for Japan. I thought I could find something more authentic in Japan. I went to Kyoto. I had met that monk I mentioned previously in Kyoto. I didn't have any contacts, but I found a place to live. I found some friends, particularly a man named Glenn Martin, a Canadian man. And together we started going to a temple called Antaiji. Antaiji is fairly well known here, even in America. It's a small temple, but it's the temple where Soaki Kodo Roshi, his disciple Uchiyama Kosho Roshi, where they were, and then people like Shohaku Okumura Roshi here teaching in the United States. A good friend of ours, Isho Fujita Roshi, also came out of Antaiji. I started going there to sit sesshin with them. This was very, very difficult. This was my first time to actually sit with other people. The Antaiji schedule was very difficult. Even to this day, they sit a very rigorous sesshin schedule. But I did that for about a year and a half. In the meantime, my friend Glenn had gone to live at Hoshinji Monastery, the monastery where I ended up spending a good part of my life. I was not quite ready to follow Glenn. I had to repay some student debts from college. Someone had advised me. He said, listen, if you're going to go to a monastery, you have to pay those debts off. Otherwise, that'll always be hanging over you. I realized that that was good advice. I worked, I taught English, and so on. I paid those loans off. In November 1976, I went to live at Hoshinji. That was the very same month that Antaiji, which had been located in Kyoto, in northern Kyoto, moved from Kyoto to Hyogo Prefecture. They had sold the little piece of land they had in Kyoto and were able to buy quite a bit of land and build a bigger temple in Hyogo. I never ended up seeing that temple. Now, I have some photos. Let's see, I have some photos to show you. But let me see here. Let me see here. Let me see. No. Oh, okay. Yes. Here we go. I hope you can all see this pretty well. I wouldn't mind having that other background gone. If I do this, maybe that'll work. Is that okay, or is that too big? Anyway, I think this will work. This is Hoshinji Monastery. I have many. I'm not a big photo guy, but over the years, I found some photos came my way. I took a few photos myself. And this is a photo of what is called the Soto at the monastery. Also, we would call it the Zendo. So this is where the monks sat. And as you notice, there is snow. Very beautiful snow. And I arrived in November 1976. And during Rohat Sesshin, which started not long after I arrived, it snowed. And it was cold. I was not ready. My body was not acclimatized. There was no heat in the room where I was staying. And I remember I got quite a serious cold. But anyway, I got off to a little bit of a difficult start. It was, as you might imagine, monastic life is challenging in Japan. Now here's another photo of Hoshinji Monastery. And let's see. Okay, I think that looks even better. Very nice. Okay. This is in early spring. Hoshinji Monastery is located in Obama, same as Barak, Obama, about 50 kilometers from Kyoto. As the bird flies, it's on the seaside of Japan. And looking at this photo, you get a little bit bigger idea of the monastery. In Japan, there are some 15,000 Soto temples, but there are only 25 or so or less, nowadays even less, monasteries that were called Senmon Soto. These are monasteries where monks could go and receive the education they need to become certified as a temple priest. But this is a relatively small one. You may be familiar with Eheiji and Sojiji, but Hoshinji is really more like a family temple in size. But what you have here, straight ahead, is the Dharma Hall. And the Dharma Hall is where many of the ceremonies were held. And if you can see my cursor, here on the left is the Soto, the Zendo, and on the right is the Kuin, where there was an office, the kitchen. This is where we ate, oftentimes. Further over to the right, there was the bath, and so on. This is a particularly beautiful photo of the temple, I think. I want to tell you a little bit about the life in a monastery. It's a very simple life. This is my teacher, my master, Harada Sekkei Roshi. It's relatively difficult to take photos inside the Zendo. This one was staged. They asked me to take some photos. But here you can see 3 Japanese monks. That's the way we sat, facing these shoji screens. This photo here is the outer hall, the Gaitan, which you also have at Zenshuji. And the photo at the bottom is the Naido inside of the Zendo. The monks, we also, not only did we sit here, we also slept here. These square futon could fold out, so each person had one tatami, and up above here we had our futon, and so we would sleep here at night. I often thought of it as a very tribal kind of feeling to sleep with 16, 17 other people. And now we have, so obviously Zazen was an important part of the practice. Another part was the ceremonial ritual. And I do not have photos of the daily ritual, but here you can see these were, this is called the Daihanya, Tendoku, which we did at New Year's. 3 days, the first 3 days of New Year's. And then this middle photo is when I did my Hosenshiki. About 1984, I guess. Again, my master here in the red robe. And a photo at the bottom. This is also for a Hosenshiki that's over with. This is a commemorative photo. In this case, this man here with the fan was the Shuso, a young Japanese man. This is his father, a temple priest here. And many of the parishioners, the Danka, from their temple came to observe this ceremony. So ceremonial ritual, another very important part of the monastic life. Another part, very important part of our life was work, known as samu. And depending on the season, it might be shoveling snow. Sometimes, 2 years I was there, we had an accumulated snowfall of 5 meters. 5 meters of snow. Now this is an area of Japan where it was snow and then melt, and snow and then melt. So we never had 5 meters at one time, but there were a couple times we had to get on the roof of the Ihaido and so on to remove the snow because it was just too heavy. It would destroy the roof. But this looks like we were sort of at the end. Guys, looks like they're having some fun there. Here is a person, that's me, picking tea. Every May, around May 20th, we had tea bushes in our vegetable fields, and we would go out and pick tea. So that's just another example. And then down below, you see me here. For many of the years I was at the monastery, I was in charge of the vegetable garden. And at some point we got this rototiller, which made it much easier and quicker to till soil. This looks like it's spring, getting ready for the fall planting. Here's a photo. A beautiful photo, I think. Taken again in the vegetable field. And I want you to get a little sense of the people here. Usually there were anywhere from 20 to 30 people at the monastery, and almost perfect number of people. It's good to have at least 20 because there's just so much work to do. We had a vast vegetable field, I should say fields. We grew a lot of our own food, and sometimes, because there were so many weeds, I would ask for as many people to come up to help with the weeding. And so on this particular day, you'll see several women. We always had women. I think I count 4 women from Germany, a woman from Switzerland, a man from Slovenia, a couple from Germany, and a few Western monks inside. I believe this man here was Chinese. Yes. So we had a real variety of people. One of the words in Japanese for a monastery is sorin. And this word is comprised of 2 Chinese characters. The first one means a thicket. Bushes, or bamboo, or brambles. And the second character means forest. And what this word represents is a mountain with various kinds of plants and trees growing. So it's a mixture of different kinds of plants and trees, said to be the strongest, the best condition for a mountain, as opposed to growing, let's say, Christmas trees or cryptomerias, which they do in Japan in some places. I mention that because if you get 20, 25, 30 people together, you get a real variety of people. And it was thanks to my teacher, Harada Roshi, to his great generosity, that this kind of group could gather and practice harmoniously together. Because with this kind of arrangement, it could be the case that there would be problems. Not to say that there weren't problems, but there was a minimum. Carrying on here, another important part of the practice was what we call takuhatsu. Takuhatsu was to go into town. One word is begging or asking for alms. We generally did this 3 days a month. However, during January, from January 6th to February 3rd every year, we went out every morning. This is called kangyo, which literally means cold practice. As you can see, there's snow on the ground. Our feet were cold. They were immediately wet. Our hands were also very cold. Now, in the distance, here, there is another temple. We are passing by a temple called Bukokuji, which is a little bit famous here in America as well, because at this time, let's say 1980s, 90s, there were very few temples in Japan that had a concentration of non-Japanese practitioners. And this temple was about 150 yards away from Hoshinji. In fact, it was a branch temple of Hoshinji. And it's one of the other places in Japan, by coincidence or not, that there was a group of Westerners. Now, just a few other shots. I think some of these are really beautiful shots. Here we are out, as you can see, it's snowing. A woman is coming out on the left here, very likely with a coin. The man here, the monk here, has a bag in his hand. There's a flap on his bag, and he's going to receive that donation from the woman, and then he'll put it in his bag, and then we continue walking. This scene, I think, could have come out 100, 200 years ago if it weren't for this little sign here, perhaps, and maybe some of these telephone wires there. And I have another one or two. Yes, have a look at this one. On one of our better days here, you can see it's very windy, and this is me in the front here, holding onto my hat so that it doesn't blow inward out like an umbrella. But some days, just miserable. But it was our task, rain or shine, to go out as part of our practice. And one other takuhatsu picture, a great picture here. Notice the snow on the ground. This photo was taken in 1984. My teacher with the red staff in the front, he seemed to enjoy it. He was energized by going out on Kangyo. And a group, well, just a great group of guys, 15, 20, 25 people. As you may see in the back here, there are 3 Japanese women. 2 of them became ordained later on. And what else do I have? It wasn't only rain and snow. Sometimes we enjoyed ourselves. We even had a good party or two. This is a banquet we'd have every year on December 22nd, called Toya, the longest night of the year. This is a Zen tradition, not only in our temple, but in Zen monasteries. And this came about when Zen monasteries were really very, very poor. They would save this date for a banquet, and we were expected to make food as well. And not only food, we had skits. Yes, these 2 guys are playing sumo. I think you know sumo wrestling. They're having fun there, and I'm the referee. Okay? And then sometimes we would gather in our rooms. Not often, guys, but sometimes it just seemed like it seemed like the right time to have a glass of beer or Coca-Cola, whatever you like to drink. And this was, you can see that everybody's in a good mood here. This was something we also did. Now here's a photo, a deer photo, taken not long after I was ordained, 1978. Almost exactly, it was March 17th, so 44 years ago. And these were all of the non-Japanese monks at Hoshinji at that time. Of course, my master in the middle. 2 Americans, 2 people from Canada, a man from France, and a man from Brazil. A couple months after this photo, I was diagnosed with tuberculosis. I had to leave the monastery. I was hospitalized for 1 year in Obama City, in the hospital. From that time on, we were able to get national health insurance. Until then, we did not have it. My teacher was the father, So all of us in the monastery were able to get health insurance. I did not have to pay a penny for that year-long hospitalization, if you can believe that. I also had to spend 9 more months at another temple after I got out of the hospital, simply because I wasn't strong enough to go back to the monastery, but I did. I did recover, and I did go back. And I finally ended up living there for more than 25 years. I'd like to say just a little bit about Harada Roshi and working with him. We had, at this monastery, we had 6 sesshin, 6 week-long retreats every year. April, May, June, always the first 7 days. October, November, December, always the first 7 days of those months. Then we had a shorter one after Kangyo was over in February. Those were like the centerpiece of the training seasons, what we call the Ango. So we had an Ango in the spring, summer, and one in the fall, winter. The sesshin were very important. Another important part of the practice was Dokusan. Dokusan were the private interviews that we had with Harada Roshi. We would go and meet with him in a special room, and he gave us guidance in our zazen. Or if we had questions about Buddhism, or even sometimes we had questions about our own life. He was like our father, really, in that regard. I was in the situation where, because I had been there a longer time, I learned to speak Japanese such that I often had the opportunity to translate for people who came to the temple who did not speak Japanese. So I got to see him talk to quite a few people. An amazing experience. In my mind, he was an enlightened human being. I have a couple of, I just have a couple other shots. I traveled with him twice. Here we are in Agra, in India, at the Red Fort. The smell was quite strong at the Red Fort and quite difficult for Harada Roshi. He was kind of overwhelmed by the smell, I remember, but there we are. And I went to India twice with him. And here we are in Minnesota at Hokyoji. Kind of a blurry photo, but it has a little bit of atmosphere. And again, I was translating for him, so he's giving me a little pep talk, or maybe telling me a little bit about what he's going to say during his talk. He visited the United States twice. Once to go to do sesshin in Minnesota, and once in California, including LA at ZCLA. And what else? Making mochi. He was not a very physically active guy, but when we did mochi, he was really fond of coming out, and he would always pick the biggest hammer. He loved to do that. I'd like to finish off my talk here with a couple of teachings. This is perhaps Dogen Zenji's most famous teaching, and one that Takagi Sensei also showed us last month. The translation is one that I like, and it's one that I've tweaked. I've always preferred the word study as opposed to the word learn, and just because study, in my mind, indicates a little bit more of a one-pointedness. So, to study the way of Buddha is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self, and so on. And you've noticed that I've capitalized the first self. Dogen Zenji uses the same word, jiko, in Japanese, but I think, from my understanding of this teaching, it's easy for us to understand this if we capitalize the first self. To study the way of Buddha, In other words, to study the way of liberation is to study the big self, the universal self, the self that is literally one with the universe. And then Dogen continues, to study that big self is to forget the small self, the ego, that sense of me, which is, as we know from the Buddhist teaching, that is an illusion. And we have a teaching in my lineage that if we forget the ego, then there's nothing that isn't the self. Such a beautiful teaching. If there's nothing that isn't the self, that means it's impossible to harm. I mean, I feel that's the true meaning of the precepts, to really understand the oneness of all things, which is expressed in these other lines. To forget the small self is to be confirmed by all dharmas. Then all things that we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think are the self. To be confirmed by all dharmas is to cast off the body and mind of self as well as others. All trace of enlightenment disappears. When that enlightenment takes place, there's no longer anybody who's enlightened. There's no longer any distinction between somebody who's enlightened and somebody who isn't. And this traceless enlightenment continues without end. Fabulous teaching by Dogen Zenji. And to conclude, I would like to share with you this teaching from my teacher, Harada Sekkei Roshi. He lived to the age of 93, but towards the end of his life, he gradually was unable to speak. I believe that's called aphasic. And so there was a certain time when he was no longer even to communicate. And this short piece is the last thing that I received, and others as well, not only me, but this was sent out digitally. And I received this when I was actually working in LA at Zenshuji. And just to give you a little sense of my teacher's teaching. As we approach the autumn sesshin, so as I mentioned, October, November, December, so it's very likely he wrote this in September. As we approach the autumn sesshin at Hoshinji Monastery, there's something I've often been thinking about lately that I want to convey to you. There's nothing bigger than Zen, and there's nothing smaller than Zen. Zen is simply Zen. If you sit in Zazen, thinking that something not already here will appear or will be born, that isn't Zazen at all. If the thought arises, this sitting, this Zazen is a good thing, that isn't Zazen. Even if you think of nothing while you're sitting, nothing remains. It is necessary to sit and eliminate nothing. Zen isn't something to speak about, so I sit without saying anything. This is the 9 years facing a wall that Great Master Bodhidharma sat. If Great Master Bodhidharma sat for 9 years, I will sit for 18 years, twice as long as he did. Mind you, he was in his late 80s when he said this. The wall of facing a wall refers to all things in this world. I will only sit quietly, facing all those walls. Unfortunately, the situation now in Japan is one that has been turned upside down. Zen has become a commercial product where various people, equipment, and buildings are necessary because of the bright and splendid ceremonies. While I cannot deny this sad situation where it has come to be like this, I would like you to always remember that even within this situation, Zen has always been sitting, and the only thing necessary to do this is a place to sit. All right then. I hope everybody was able to hear that. Were you able to hear that, guys? John, could you hear that?
Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you.
All right.
Great.
Okay, now it's your guys' turn. you get to ask questions. We have half an hour or so, I think. And
anybody have a-
listen, everybody's got to ask a question. It's not if anybody has a question. You can either, how are we going to do this, John? Can you see all the people?
Pretty much. So yeah, I can unmute and we can ask questions directly.
You can clear your throat or say, excuse me, or I have a question. Or I guess you can put it in chat too. But fire away.
Both raise your hand and unmute.
Yeah, if you raise your hand, we can unmute you. Kumi Kalas.
I just have a quick question.
Hi, Kumi. Hi, Kumi.
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I'm great.
Thank you. It was wonderful to hear the story about your life there. I know you were in Japan for that many years, but how did you learn Japanese to the point where you can do such eloquent and perfect interpretations and translations? Did you go to a school, or how were you taught?
You know, I went to school in Japan. It was an American school. I did not go to a Japanese school. Some of my younger siblings did, and they learned to speak like a Japanese. In fact, I have 2 siblings that still live in Japan. Oh. For myself, I was 10 going on 11. I think it was just a little bit too old to soak it in like a sponge, like a young kid does. Mm-hmm. I did not learn to speak Japanese until later. Of course, I could get around and do. I was fine getting around Japan, but to have a conversation was not that easy. I mentioned that I was hospitalized with TB. I taught myself to read and write Japanese when I was in the hospital. Wow. Also at that time, we had just started to tape my teacher's talks. So when I was in the hospital, I had one of those old Sony cassette mm-hmm. players, and I would listen to those cassettes over and over and over. And if I didn't know the words, I would jot them down, and I would get someone to help me. So it was a lot of self-study, and I have to say, I don't feel that proficient in Japanese. I've just done the best I could.
Sounds pretty impressive.
Thank you. It's a difficult language, at least for me.
Very much so. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a question in chat that Dorothy Fu Wong asks, what impact has Zen made on American culture? What is your take on that, Daigaku?
Wow. I think the West Coast is probably the area of the United States that's been influenced the most. But first of all, it's a word that everybody, or virtually everybody, I wouldn't say everybody, but most people are familiar with. So that in itself is quite remarkable. Lately, I've been speaking at local high schools, and I'll often ask them, have you heard the word Zen? Sure. Well, what do you think, what comes to mind when you hear the word Zen? And they're very likely to say meditation, peace, calm, something like that, those 3 words. And nowadays, there are many, many more people meditating. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I think it was fairly unusual to find people who meditated on a regular basis. But now I think it's more uncommon to find people, well, those are the circles I travel in, of course. Let me just say there are a lot more people meditating. Whether Zen is responsible for that or not, I think it's been a contributing factor. There's also, Zen has had an influence aesthetically, the Japanese aesthetic of simplicity, of nature. But things like haiku, martial arts, what else? Architecture to some extent. You see these screens behind me. Just in little ways as well, I think Zen has had a tremendous influence on American culture. And it will only continue, I believe.
Thank you, Daigaku. Jerry Morrow's got a
I
question.
see another.
Where did that chat go?
What is the most lasting teaching that you learned from Harada Roshi? That's difficult to say, Jerry, in one word. But he has been an immense influence on my life, such that I'm still practicing. That's one thing. As I mentioned, I thought of him as an enlightened human being. So he was a model to me of what a person could be. Not that we would all become the same, but somebody who, he represented a person who no longer thought about himself. He was only concerned about what he could do for other people. Now, I have not reached that point, obviously, but if I were to think of one teaching, I'm just taking one that comes to mind. It's that we live within Zazen. You know, when we hear the word Zazen, when most people hear the word Zazen, that people who know the word, a lot of people know the word Zen. They have some image of Zen. But Zazen, the sitting Zazen, they may not recognize that word. We associate that with somebody sitting quietly. And that even comes out in that teaching that I just put up on the screen there, where that he says he's going to sit for 18 years. But I believe, thinking about that teaching there, that his teaching was that sitting is much more than just sitting on a cushion. And rather that our practice is to live within Zazen, such that whatever activity we're doing is Zazen. If the understanding, the attitude is that we're going to eliminate that sense of separation between me and the activity, or me and the other person, which is the objective of Zen. So that really broadens the meaning of Zazen. That whatever we're doing, the aspiration there is that whatever environment we're in, we are one with that environment. And that's the truth of our life. We always are one. It's simply that because of self-consciousness, because we perceive the self, we create that separation. And it's up to us. The only way that that's going to diminish is the effort we make. So something like that, Jerry.
Michael and Lauren have it. Okay.
Jikyo, what prompted you to leave the monastery? Yeah. Why am I not still at the monastery? Periodically, while I was in the monastery, I wouldn't know if it was what do you call that? A crisis. You know, I would go through a questioning to myself. How much longer am I going to be at the monastery? Mind you, 25 years is a long time. Anyway, but it seemed to me about every year and a half or so, I'd go through this questioning. How much longer am I going to be there? And I always answered that question with saying, this is the very best place for me to be. We had a world-class teacher. We had an ideal environment. That small city of Obama still supported us when we went out on Takuhatsu. The Danka of the temple let us stay there. It was a semi-rural situation. It was on the outside of a small town. We had We had a quiet environment right next to the mountains. The group of people who came there were pretty much of the same spirit. They had the aspiration to realize the way, whether they were Japanese or not Japanese. And so I couldn't think of a better situation, really. Furthermore, I had found two ways to be useful in the monastery. One was to grow vegetables. This is something I loved to do. It was challenging. It was a very humid environment. And we were trying to grow these things organically. It was an ongoing challenge to grow Napa cabbage, hakusai, for example, or you name it. There were bugs everywhere. But how to do that? How to provide vegetables for the monastery? That was the objective. It was challenging, something I enjoyed doing. And then there was the other part of doing translation work, which I very much enjoyed. In fact, I still enjoy doing that. And since I found a certain meaning in life, I was able to stay. At one point, my teacher was appointed to be the director of Soto Zen in Europe. It was 2003, 2002, I think. And he asked me to go with him. I was going to be his interpreter in Milan, in Italy. But then at the last moment, it turned out, they said, no, we've got a better guy in Italy. He can speak French, English, Italian, and Japanese. Okay. No, you're not going. So the rug was pulled out under my feet. That had happened more than once at Hoshinji. I was not overly surprised. About 6 months later, that same group came to me and said, would you like to work in San Francisco? I thought about it. I spoke to Harada Roshi. He came back periodically from Europe. He was not overly thrilled with the idea, but he could see that this was a way for me to leave honorably, in the sense that I wouldn't be thrashing around by myself. I would be getting a salary. I would be able to live as a monk. By the way, I lived at the San Francisco Zen Center at that time, so that was a real education as well. He said, well, try it for a year. And so that was the opportunity by which I left the monastery, and I never went back. All that time I lived in California. I would go back every year to do sesshin at least once a year at Hoshinji. But I never went back there to live.
Ask a question?
Michael, please.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, Michael.
Yeah, I'm in Chicago, so we're not that far apart.
Okay.
I'm curious now that you're, are you leading a community now? Are you the teacher, in a Zen community of people who aren't living monastic lives, obviously, correct?
Yes.
So my question is, here's my question. What are you teaching in the midst of coming out of a pandemic and moving into the crisis that we're experiencing now, and at the threshold of what seems to be war?
Yeah.
What's the message? What questions are you thinking about, and how can Zen help us at this period in non-monastic life?
It's true. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that there are 4 Zen centers here in St. Louis. I am the head of one of them, the Confluence Zen Center. And it's true. All of the members, other than myself, are lay people. I've been here 7 years, and we have grown the community, and we have some exciting news. We are in the process of buying our own property, and we're going to close on March 22nd. Everything's moving ahead, and we're excited about that. I don't think, for lay people, they have their families, and many of them have their work. And so the task in their lives is really to find Zen in their everyday life. And it's true, we've been in the pandemic. Fortunately for our group, we've been able to remain open, except for 3 months at the beginning of the pandemic, because we are such a small group. And actually, the space where we've been leasing all these years has really worked out well for us. But we've been open. We've been open for Zazen. But as I was just saying, to who was it who asked me? Was that Jerry, about the teaching that I had received? For people who are working or in your family life, that's Zen. That includes dealing with the pandemic. That's just a fact of our life. We're fortunate that we're not in Ukraine, but all of these things affect us as well. These are, as my teacher said, these are the walls, or you could say the questions in our life that we face. We don't have any choice about that. And this is part of our Zazen, to really take them up in our life and look at them. That's our practice, to be one with those walls. That's the human condition. As he said, to imagine that something's going to appear, that enlightenment's going to drop down out of the sky and appear where we are now, that's not the way it is. Our life is to live in the midst of delusion, if you wish. And the way to do that, from my point of view, is Zazen. Zazen is to be the moment now, regardless of what you're doing. But I think just to say personally, with regard to the war in Ukraine, I'm thinking there's limits to what I can do about that myself. So I'm not sure how productive it is to get overly concerned, to be bombarded by things on TV and so on. That's not to say that we should be ignoring that thing, but to deal with what we can deal with in our own personal life seems to me the best way to go.
Thank you.
Can I piggyback on that, Daigaku-sensei?
Yes, Lon.
Thank you.
Lon,
And
please.
thank you, John, for making this all possible. I want to piggyback on Michael's question because it seems like the monastery at Harada Sensei's monastery, Hoshinji, seems unusual because there are men and women who practice together, so different than Eiheiji or Sojiji, or certainly the Nisoto, the women's temple, the women's monastery. I'm just wondering about how you transitioned from being in a monastery to being in San Francisco and Los Angeles and St. Louis, and now, I know you're married now, and so it seems like your life conditions changed quite significantly coming to the U.S. and just how you handled that transition, what your challenges were, how you dealt with it in terms of Zen and other ways.
Yeah, those are some big transitions, no doubt. One of my best friends from high school I'm still in contact with, he always shook his head and said, wow, that's amazing. You made that transition 25, 27 years in the monastery, and now you're living in San Francisco. I was helped when I went to San Francisco by virtue of the fact that I was living at the San Francisco Zen Center. So that was kind of a buffer. It agreed. It was different than being in a Japanese monastery. But by American standards, here was a group of people who more or less had the same interest in practicing the Dharma as they understood it. So it was a buffer from the busy city life. I lived very close to Sokoji Temple, where my office was, in the basement of Sokoji Temple. I commuted by bicycle. I never bought a car. My room and board was not I could afford all of that. So that said, I think Harada Roshi was helpful for me in that regard because he had the big picture. He had the big picture. Monastic life, in fact, here's one thing that just comes to mind. He used to joke that Zen practice was more kibishi, more strict in America than in Japan. And this is like a koan in a way, because we have this image that monastic practice in Japan, walking through the snow, wait, that's got to be tough. And I'm not saying that's not tough, but all the rules. And Japanese society is so regulated. But he had a point. And the point is that here in America, people are much more black and white. If the schedule says get up at 4 and go to bed at 9, you're going to do that every day. But in Japan, that schedule, I often thought that every day was different. You know, sometimes we get up at 4, sometimes 5, sometimes 6. And there was that flexibility. And the way that could work is we had faith in our teacher. And so there was never any, well, I can't say never, but usually there was no question. We went along with, oh, okay, tomorrow we're getting up. Okay, we're getting up at 5, great. But here, if it says 4 o'clock, it's got to be 4. I think that's, I hope you appreciate the irony. But anyway, while I was at Hoshinji, I was able to learn to use a word processor. For those of you who don't remember word processors, WAPRO in Japanese, those were the precursors of computers. So even by the time I came to San Francisco, it wasn't that difficult to learn how to use a computer. You might think a guy coming out of a monastery, I remember another anecdote. Gary Snyder, the well-known poet, came to visit Hoshinji, and it was a great thrill for me to show him around the monastery. And he peeked into the kitchen. He said, "Oh, you have refrigerators." Now, Gary Snyder had been in a Zen monastery in Kyoto in the 1950s, and presumably they did not have refrigerators in the monastery kitchens at that time. But we had 2 big refrigerators we also had 2 cars. So my point is that I think I benefited a lot from my teachers' open-mindedness. I would say that enlightenment. So, long story short, moving from San Francisco to LA to St. Louis, getting married hasn't been that difficult. They've just been steps along the way. And I think that's a sign that I received good training. Do I see another question, John?
Does Michael still have a question?
Here's a question. Joken. Thank you very much for the lecture. I would like to, he has 2 questions. How do you see the adaptation of Soto Shu practices and teachings in Western countries? Do you remember the name of the Brazilian monk at Hoshinji Monastery? Yes, I do remember. The Brazilian monk's name was Takujun Minemoto. He became a naturalized Japanese citizen. What do I think? How do I see the adaptation of Soto practices and teachings in Western countries? Wow, that's a big question. Well, I think it's inevitable, Joken-san, that there will be adaptations. as I was explaining earlier here. For example, in my small group, everybody is a layperson except myself. So we have very, very little ceremonial form. But we do read sutras every time we get together. Some of them are in English. One of them, Daihi Shindarani, we're doing quite well with that. The people have learned how to do the Mokugyo, so we're adapting that to our practice quite well. But the main part of our practice is sitting zazen and the various study groups that I lead. So I think that adaptation is going quite well, and I think that's unavoidable. I have to be honest with you, I have some, I mean, even in Japan, you know, the situation with Zen and truly great teachers is, we're in a situation where the great teachers are very few now. And this is a concern for me, both in Japan and America. I can only sincerely hope that the spark is still there somewhere. I don't know if I've answered your question very well, but I think as far as the form goes, we're adapting quite well the Soto teachings and practices.
I think that's also shown out, Daigaku, because your Zen Center is growing, both in size and in the number of people that are coming to learn about Zen.
Yeah. No, I told you, man, we're excited about our new place, and it feels to me like we're coming out of the pandemic.
Yes,
Spring is on its way. We had some snow the other day, but spring is on its way. A new, bigger place. You know, there are many people. There are many people who could benefit from Zen practice, and we aspire to share that with as many people as we can. Yep.
Great. That is great. And speaking of that, you've worked as a translator for Roshi's teachings, and you've also worked with Blueprint of Enlightenment by Inui Roshi. Do you have anything else coming up in terms of translation work?
I'm glad you asked that, John. I want to show you. This is the book I'm now translating. 800 pages. It's fairly big print, but this is Inui Roshi here. Beautiful. Isn't that a beautiful book cover?
That is.
It's silk. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, they just do some things in Japan so beautifully. This particular book is his commentary on Keizan Zenji's Denko Roku, one of the seminal texts in Soto Shu. And it's a work that I feel has not been very well explained in Japan even, or in the West. And so I'm working on this translation with a small crew of people, and this year we hope to publish the first of 4 volumes. It'll be the first 13 chapters of this 53 chapter book. And I have to tell you that translation has been such an important part of my life as an inspiration to continue on this way. I just feel very grateful to have been given this opportunity. Yeah. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really look forward to reading that. So please
I'll let you know. I'll let you know when it's out. We're going to self-publish it.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's really good.
Yeah, yeah. Any more questions? Do we have any more time, or are we?
Yeah, I got a
People-
We do have
question.
some time.
Conrad Soto. Can you hear me?
Conrad.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Conrad.
Hi. So I guess for lay people, as you said, Zen is being one with the environment, and that's I guess the life away from sitting, which is what most of our life is while not sitting. But to aid in having been in being at Zen with our everyday life, I guess we have sitting like Zen, and I'm wondering how important. I guess it's at your center. People are key focuses on sitting, and it is elsewhere in a lot of places. So, how much Zazen is needed if one is not a monk but a lay person? I guess I'm not sure. In Japan, for instance, the lay people in Japan may not, and even perhaps even Zenshuji or the Japanese American Temple in San Francisco, perhaps lay people aren't as focused on sitting as perhaps in the U.S. where you have Zen centers, which is like a hybrid. But I guess sitting is like still fundamental for lay people, and that aids that person in having Zen in their everyday life by being at one with themselves. So I myself haven't been sitting too much lately. So how much should one sit to feel? Is there some kind of a guideline?
I think it's,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's important to sit every day, to decide a time, morning, afternoon, evening, whatever works for you. It could be 10 minutes, 15, 20, but I think it's important to decide, I'm going to sit at this time. Because you're right, sitting is the anchor of our practice. Sitting, Zen practice isn't about reading about it and thinking about it. It's about actually doing it. It's a body practice. It's something that's good to do every day. And furthermore, to sit with a group. At Zenshuji, for example, you have a beautiful Zendo there. They have their regular sitting, Saturday, Sunday. I would encourage you to go and sit with the group. It's very easy to sit within our own ideas. And in my mind, earlier someone was asking me, what is the important teaching you've learned? You know, Zen is really to let go of your own ideas, of the way you think things should be or shouldn't be. And we have this lovely practice, just sitting, to be able to sit and leave and not react to thought, to let thought come and go. I mean, it's a beautiful practice. So I encourage you to do that. 10 minutes, 20, 30, 40. I encourage you to make that part of your life.
Thank you. I just have a couple more questions, short questions. I
Okay.
guess to assist, to aid, assist or to guide the sitting that one does. Sorry, one does. You have like literature such as reading Shobogenzo, or you have the temple
Yeah.
monks who can, or you have study classes.
Yeah.
Or I guess if you're a monk, you can do like a doksan or something. But
Right.
I guess any of those, it doesn't really matter. It's basically sitting is in a group and sitting by yourself. Both are once a day. Both are good, important.
Allow me to introduce your book. Conrad, have you ever read this book?
Yes.
You have.
Yes, I have. Essence of Zen, yes.
You know, when I was at Zenshuji, maybe I recommended that book to you. excuse me for sounding so tied to my teacher, but I recommend, here's another one. Oh wait, I'd have to get up maybe to find it. I also recommend this one by my teacher's teacher. Have you read this one?
I have the book. I haven't read the in the entirety yet.
You know, these books are really teaching the basics. And, you know, to read a little bit, to find a teacher that resonates with your practice. I mean, these are not necessarily easy things to do, but it's possible. It's possible to find these. These are important conditions, and you have to find them. But that's my recommendation. You have one more question?
Just one. This is like a very unimportant, almost unimportant, but mindfulness. I guess there's some, people who practice mindfulness, and it seems like possibly it's related to Buddhism or possibly even Zen. Maybe not related, but had some similar aspects from people looking at it from the outside. What do you think about mindfulness practice?
I think it's not a bad place for many people to start, to pay attention to what you're doing. I mean, what could be wrong with that? I mean, we need people to be paying more attention to what they're doing. But I don't think it's the same as Zen in the long run, for the same the reason being that as long as somebody is being mindful, that's two things. The objective of Zen is one thing, to realize the oneness of all things. And that applies to Zazen as well. As long as I'm doing Zazen, there's a separation. I was always taught that the practice of Zazen is to eliminate that sense of separation. So I think in that regard, with that understanding, that Zen goes beyond what we usually think of as mindfulness.
Thank you.
I think we've run out of time. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I think so. We are at the end. Does anyone have a last question or anything anyone would like to say?
One more burning question. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight.
Yes,
yeah,
thank you for contributing. This has just been
absolutely.
Absolutely. It's been great to
thanks
learn about
also thanks to Lon. Thanks to Lon for inviting me to speak. Lon Sensei.
Yes, thank you, Lon.
Thank you, John, for being the moderator.
Thank you, Daigaku. And I'd just like to point out to everyone.
I plan to be in LA. I plan to be in LA in November.
Good.
For the big Jukai, the Jukai ceremony. So I'm hoping to see all my old friends from LA at that time.
Hopefully many of them will be out and we'll get together.
Middle of November. Yep. Okay, guys. Thanks so much. Take care. And don't forget to sit.
Take care, Daigaku.
Bye-bye.
And for everybody who's still here, in April, on the 16th, we're having another Zen discussion, One Nun, Two Faiths, and Two Countries. It's a talk by Reverend Yuko Wakayama. So it's a woman's take on growing up in Zen. So that will be really interesting. And hopefully we'll see you back. Good night and thank you.
I want to say hi to all my friends. I want to say hi to all my friends around the world. Take care, everybody.
You too. Good to see you.
Thank you, Daigaku Sensei.
Thank you so much.
Hi, arigato.
Arigato.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Wonderful to see you.
Yeah, so many friends. Great. Very good.
Many thank
Very
you.
good. Bye.
No one wants to leave.
No one wants to leave.
We could have a Zoom party, a Zoom party.
You
We
look great.
could all have a sip of beer or whatever, your choice, Coca-Cola or beer, and talk about old times. Okay, guys,
Bye-bye.
take care.
Good night.
Very good. See you.
Nine.